For a long time, society operated under an unspoken rule when it came to religion. You handled it with kid gloves. This social contract, often called accommodationism, demanded that matters of faith be shielded from the kind of rigorous critique we readily apply to almost everything else in life. Culturally, belief was treated as a rigid, binary system. You were either a true believer with absolute, unwavering faith, or you were an absolute denier. There was no room for nuance, let alone scientific inquiry. Because of this stark divide, even completely secular people felt pressured to play along. People paid lip service to ecumenicism, publicly pretending to respect religious doctrines simply to avoid causing offense at the dinner table. This polite silence carried a significant intellectual cost. By hiding behind a wall of unearned respect, religious claims were effectively insulated from logical scrutiny. You couldn't test the claims because you weren't allowed to ask the questions. Then came a near-simultaneous publishing phenomenon in the mid-2000s that shattered this polite silence. Within a span of a few years, a handful of authors released best-selling books that collectively birthed the movement known as New Atheism. At the forefront was the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, whose book The God Delusion struck a chord with a global audience. Alongside him was Christopher Hitchens, a journalist who challenged the moral authority of religious institutions. Sam Harris, a neuroscientist, argued that faith should not offer a free pass to ignore evidence. And Daniel Dennett, a philosopher of science, anchored the group by exploring how religious belief itself evolved as a natural phenomenon. These four writers presented a unified argument to the cultural zeitgeist. A deity should be viewed as a scientific hypothesis, subject to the rules of evidence, rather than a magical entity exempt from criticism. If you decide to treat God as a scientific hypothesis, you run into a practical problem. You need a reliable way to measure it. You need to assign it a probability. To solve this, Dawkins introduced the spectrum of theistic probability. He replaced the binary switch with a 1 to 7 scale. Milestone 1 is the strong theist, with 100% dogmatic faith. Milestones 2 and 3 acknowledge some uncertainty, but assume a higher power. Center milestone 4 is the completely impartial agnostic, exactly 50-50. Milestone 5 is the leaning atheist, highly skeptical of religious claims. Milestone 7 is the strong atheist, claiming absolute certainty there is no God. The real action is milestone 6, the de facto atheist. They assign a very low probability to a deity, but stop just short of 0. When pressed, Dawkins and his prominent peers refuse to identify as a 7. Dawkins categorizes his own worldview as a 6, or, as he clarified in later interviews, a 6.9. New atheism injures itself in the scientific method. Claiming absolute, unshakable certainty about the non-existence of something requires adopting the same kind of blind, dogmatic faith that science is designed to replace. This approach relies on a strict requirement for evidence. A 6 leaves the door cracked open, acknowledging that a rational person must always be willing to change their mind if new data actually appears. In the decade after its release, The God Delusion saw tens of millions of downloads, even in regions where its distribution was a crime. This reach led secular critics like Hemant Mehta to suggest that, aside from the Bible, no other book in history has generated more new non-believers. It provided the vocabulary for millions to be openly and unapologetically secular in the public square. It offered a framework for those who previously felt isolated by their skepticism. The spectrum provided an intellectually robust framework, presenting atheism as a respectable scientific stance rather than a taboo personal failing. By replacing a rigid toggle switch with a fluid, evidence-based spectrum, Dawkins redefined the vocabulary of belief. He showed that you do not need dogmatic certainty to confidently reject the supernatural. You simply need the honesty to follow the evidence where it leads.